the various groups as they got established, the Presbyterians, the Quakers, and the Baptists, got a little bit frustrated with that situation, and one by one they would come up with me and suggest that I turn it over to them, and they would make better use of it, and I replied to each one of them in turn that as soon as they could demonstrate to my satisfaction that God were either a Presbyterian, a Quaker, or a Baptist, that I would happily turn it over to them. But they were not able to do that, so I continued letting them use it, but holding out because I knew for a fact that God was going to send me a Universalist preacher to spread the gospel of universal love. And in fact, in September of 1770, he appeared. He was not aware at the time that he appeared that that's who he was, but John Murray was a much younger man than I. He was in his early 30s when he appeared here. He was heading over to this country, having suffered a whole series of devastating life experiences and wanting to start over. His ship was heading for New York. In fact, went to Philadelphia first, and the large ocean-going vessel was coasting off of the Barrier Island and was swept in an early morning fog and heavy wind off of the ocean over a break in the island which no longer exists, which was called Cranberry Inlet, and was pushed up against the sand. Couldn't get off. The captain tried a trick. He offloaded as much of the cargo onto a smaller boat that he rented for that purpose, put some sailors on to oversee things, asked John Murray, who was just a passenger, if he would mind going on to make sure everything went smoothly, and the maneuver worked. The captain was able to get the boat back off the sand, across the bay, across Cranberry Inlet, and back to the open ocean. The sailors and John Murray followed him, but just when they hit Cranberry Inlet, the wind picked up again and pushed them back into the bay, upon which the captain of the larger vessel shrugged his shoulders and proceeded to New York, leaving them behind. They came ashore, not very far from here, at the mouth of Cedar Creek, and headed down this way. They were looking for food. John says that he left the sailors in a tavern which used to be just on the other side of the cemetery, and as I have indicated before, being sailors, I suspect they thought a tavern was a very fine place to have been left. But the tavern didn't have enough food, it hadn't been able to keep them occupied, but John came on by paths that were more direct in those days to my house, and I happened to be sitting on my front porch, and I happened to have a whole basket of freshly caught fish that we had brought in earlier that day. John asked if he could purchase some fish from me. I absolutely refused to sell them, and I told him that I got them for free from the ocean, and I was absolutely delighted to give it to him for free. He took the fish over to the tavern to take care of the sailors, but as was my custom, it was very clear that this was a man who was educated, from whom I could learn, and I invited him to come back and spend the night at my house after he had taken care of his charges. And since that probably was a much more attractive prospect than spending the night on a sawdust floor on the tavern with a bunch of drunken sailors, he gratefully accepted. He came back. I hadn't told him this yet at this point, but earlier that day I had been working down by the bay, and I had seen the vessel trapped on the sand, and a voice had come to me. I won't tell you how often voices came to me, but one definitely did that day and said, "Potter, in that vessel is the Universalist preacher you have been waiting for." And then just then, as Murray was coming back to my house, the same voice came to me and said, "Potter, this is the Universalist preacher I have sent you." When I told John this, he was completely flabbergasted. He said, "You've got it all wrong." But we continued our conversation, and it became clear immediately he was in fact a Universalist. He was in fact a preacher, having done some lay preaching in England. At that point I knew for absolute fact that the wind was never going to change, the boat was never going to leave the bay until he gave a sermon in the meeting house that I had built for that express purpose 10 years earlier. We went back and forth. This was Wednesday, beautiful day like this. He finally relented, and we reached a compromise. If the following Sunday the boat were still trapped in the bay, he agreed that he would give the sermon. If in the interim the wind changed and he was able to go, he was going to leave. I have to say he spent a great deal of time in the intervening several days on his knees in his room praying to his God with all of his heart and all of his soul and all of his might that the wind would change so he could leave, because he did not want to give the sermon, because he knew that if he did, that was a sign from God as to what he wanted John to spend the rest of his life doing, and Murray was not at all sure he was up to it. But as I was completely convinced and confident, and as you all know actually happened, the wind did not change, On Saturday evening, I sent out runners and riders in all directions and gathered the entire community of people who lived here at that time, which is about half the number as are sitting here today. And we all crowded into the chapel, and John Murray gave one of his typical 3.5-hour textless sermons on the gospel of the universal love. Other than the day I married Mary, the happiest day of my life. As soon as he was finished speaking, one of the sailors ran up and said, at that moment the wind had changed, and he was free to go, which the early Universalists considered to be the only miracle in Universalist history. I can tell them of a few other miracles that have also happened, but they don't want to hear about it. And you probably don't either, because at that point he didn't immediately leave. He stayed for a while, and part of him I think wanted to stay here, but his message was so compelling, and he was such a wonderful speaker that he ended up in Gloucester and in Boston, and was instrumental in the creation of the Universalist movement, of which we are all a part. But I'm extremely happy that I was able to play my small part in that happening. Thank you very much.